This is Jim Schwab, manager of the American Planning Association Hazards Planning Research Center. With me today is James Rausse, who's the president of our New York Metro chapter of APA, who also works for the Bronx Borough President in his day job. And we're going to talk about the impacts of Superstorm Sandy in New York City and some of the related issues. And let me start, James, by just asking you for a little comparison. This isn't the first time a storm has made it to New York of this nature. You had Hurricane Irene, but it certainly had very different impacts and a very different direction to it than was the case with Sandy this time. Could you tell us a little about, the difference in terms of how that affected New York?
Absolutely. Hurricane Irene didn't have much of an impact on New York City, Long Island, and the lower Hudson Valley counties as much as it did on the mid-Hudson and upper Hudson and through Vermont. So I think the reaction to Sandy was, oh, this is just going to be another Irene. And the reason we kind of battened down the hatches for Irene and didn't really receive much impact because the mayor had received a lot of criticism as response to a blizzard the year before, and the logistics with that didn't fail, but did not go smoothly. So we had, over-prepared was the feeling of many for Irene. And so when they were talking about Sandy, they just thought, well, Irene hit, the upper Hudson Valley, and most hurricanes, happen in the middle Atlantic and southern states. Irene was just, a one-time thing, and it wasn't that bad, so Sandy won't be that bad either. And so a lot of communities didn't evacuate. A lot of communities felt like the prep work that they had already done and, just simply boarding up their homes and just, making sure no one goes outside was enough. And unfortunately, we were very wrong.
So a bit of an element of the perception, let's say, of having cried wolf.
Yes. This is not something we deal with regularly. Blizzards, sure, but high winds and flooding. If winds reach 50 miles an hour in the New York metro region, that's considered a hurricane for us, and we usually don't see much damage.
Mm-hmm. Well, it did produce some damage, so let's talk about some of that and what you know, at least so far, about what actually happened.
Yeah, it's been fairly devastating. Mm-hmm. I was able to go out this past weekend with Paul Farmer and former chapter president Donald Burns to assess the area because the chapter is working with a local development corporation, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And it's definitely very devastated. Long Island, for example, many communities we weren't talking to for weeks just because the communications were down, power lines were obliterated, and the coordination just with the power companies had been very difficult. Governor Cuomo has been very critical of LIPA, calling for a replacement entity because the communication between LIPA and its customers and just their ability to get services back up was very difficult. And LIPA actually serves the Rockaways, and so since it's technically not part of Long Island, they felt they were especially neglected since it's technically part of New York City. But Staten Island was, which is an relatively isolated community compared to the rest of the region, was very devastated on their beaches and the low-lying areas. There's a huge swath of marshland covering Staten Island, so there was a lot of encroachment from that, and a lot of people who lived as far as a mile from that marshland were completely flooded out, 6 to 10 feet in some cases. And when the region usually experiences flooding, you're talking in inches, not feet. And as I said, on our tour of the Rockaways with Paul, the farther west we met in the far Rockaway and kept going west. The farther west we got, which is more towards the tip of the peninsula, the worse it got. We went as far as Rockaway Beach on Beach 116th Street, walked to the boardwalk, or I should say where the former boardwalk was, and instead there were just 8 to 10 foot mounds of sand that were pushed from the water surge onto the streets and sidewalks. We were walking about three blocks in from the water, and there was still remnants of sand that had pushed its way 3 blocks in from the shore.
And of course, that's pretty much the most completely exposed area of the Rockaways at that end, right? A couple of the items you mentioned have something to do with infrastructure. Let's tackle that question for a second in terms of both what happened and what the implications are for rebuilding. First, in terms of the power system, that was obviously compromised pretty severely,
Yes.
at least initially.
Yeah. Places like the Rockaways and parts of Staten Island, in a New York City sense, has old infrastructure. A lot of the country has overhead power lines, but much of New York City doesn't. And so places like the Rockaways and Staten Island, they're still getting up to speed. It's not always makes the most economic sense to have power lines underground. Actually, many communities in Staten Island had just installed sewer systems that were running on septic systems, which you think New York City.
You'd never expect that.
Probably, one of the largest sewer systems in the world. Maybe not the most efficient combined sewer system, but one of the largest sewer systems in the world. Their infrastructure is still getting up to speed slowly but surely. But there is definitely more of an impetus for that, after the storm, and so it's reconsidering, how we can strategize in bringing power to these areas without rebuilding incorrectly. But it's difficult because the Rockaways are such a low-lying area. How deep do we rebuild power lines if we do put them underground? Because putting them above ground, we're seeing the effects. It wasn't only out in Breezy Point. Along the commercial strips, there was a whole stretch of businesses that were charred to a crisp from salt water, hitting a transformer, going up through, and just, this series of businesses just simply exploded and just burnt to the ground.
And there was no way for the fire department to get out there.
That from happening.
Yeah. In all that water, there's no way for the fire department to access those areas at that
Exactly.
point. Yeah.
The irony of it is that the Rockaways is home to a number of firefighters, and so a lot of firefighters who were out in Lower Manhattan, Staten Island, had to get updates about, do I still have a home?
Right.
Just a lot burning down, but just in these isolated communities, we need to think not only about power infrastructure, but in combining them with new transportation infrastructure. A lot of the rail lines were completely devastated. The A train is still not running to the Rockaways. They were able to get a shuttle train up going across the Rockaways. But I know out in Long Island, and particularly New Jersey, their coastal rail lines were devastated. Long Beach, which was another affected community, it's a big vacation community, summer weekend home for people, just got rail service back this weekend. And so it's been about a month, and I know New Jersey coast train line got up and running this week. We were talking about that there were houses and boats on top of train lines that they had to remove.
Yeah, what kind of discussion has there been so far in the city about potentially better protections for things like the subway system where it got flooded, and ways of trying to keep some of the water out of that system? Well,
the thing about the New York City subway system is that they actually have a really great, amazing pumping system. It's running 24/7 and keeps the subways as dry as possible. The problem was that it was the surge of salt water, and the salt water would be the amount of salt water was immediately corrosive, and a lot of the generators and the transformers exploded in the subways, and so the pumps shut down. And so it's finding new means of keeping those generators running, maybe from a remote location, just as a backup. We may have the North America's most expansive transit system, but we also have one of the oldest. And so it's really difficult, just doing basic maintenance, let alone implementing new technologies to get that up to speed. But I think after this, when you have everything below 40th Street shut down for a week, there is an urgency to seriously invest in that infrastructure. Also, just in terms of the Rockaways, as I mentioned, the A train. Luckily, the Long Island Railroad, which goes to Far Rockaway and kind of backpedals from Long Island back into the city, that was up and running. But the A train is kind of on a very narrow bridge that goes across Jamaica Bay, and that was, completely destroyed for all intents and purposes. So it's how do we reinforce those tracks, building stronger piles potentially. Because that's essentially the lifeline of the Rockaways, getting in and out if you don't have a car, and many people on the Rockaways don't.
Okay. Let's talk about the role of the chapter, since you are representing the New York Metro chapter of APA. What sort of involvement is the chapter developing at this point? How are they engaging? It's certainly got to be a challenge, because some of them have to be among the people who've also suffered some property damage and outages and such.
No, absolutely. A fair amount of our board were isolated, and they said luckily they lived within a mile and a half of a cafe or a Starbucks if they were in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, or lower Manhattan, that they could walk, charge their phone, give Facebook updates to say, I'm okay quickly, and that was it. But we also have a number of members who are on Long Island. And I was extremely worried because it had been a week and we had heard nothing from any of them. So we didn't know if they had homes, let alone communication. And so luckily everyone we knew, came out fine. But we've been extremely active. I've been on a number of calls with the New York State Department of State, who, are really want to take a regional approach. We were talking about Irene earlier. And, they said, we had never dealt with anything like Irene before. And so we went municipality by municipality, giving grants and just doing quick workshops based on a FEMA model of recovery. And they said, we noticed after months that didn't work because we were just throwing money at municipalities. And they're like, we have a mayor and 2 staff to run this, and we don't really know what to do. And so they said they completely needed to rethink their approach, and they're really looking to take a regional focus, which is what we're interested in doing right now. I was just on the phone with Pratt Institute and AIA, who both have been active, and the crux of the conversation had been, we can't do this independently because we'll be working at cross purposes, stepping on each other's toes. So we've been reaching out to all the organizations and groups. I've been in touch with regularly with Chuck Latini, president of the New Jersey chapter. They were a little more devastated in terms of getting their infrastructure back up and running. They were probably about half a week to a week behind in some areas in terms of power. But now they're completely up and running. They've been going 100 miles an hour, which we're really glad about because, we're running along right with them. Immediately what the chapter is doing, today actually we're going out to the Rockaways to work with the Rockaway Development and Revitalization Corporation, just kind of as a first step of an overall APA initiative that, Paul, is completely behind for long-term resiliency. And we're looking to help develop a business plan just to get basic services back up and running. The Rockaways have suffered in recent decades in terms of economic development because it used to be a vacation community and it transformed into, a bedroom community as people, had cheap flights, can drive 2 or 3 hours elsewhere. And so it's been slow to recover from that shift in economy. But now is an opportunity to, leverage the resources out there, leverage the waterfront that exists, which is, kind of closed off from part of the community, and just to rebuild businesses smarter. We're looking, we've suggested building mixed use. We're going to help them identify grants and such. Additionally, into the Rockaways, we've also been reached out to Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce, and we're having initial discussions with Red Hook, which was another community that was affected, historically industrial neighborhood that's kind of isolated on the other side of the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, that's been slowly transforming into more of a residential community over the last 10 years. And so addressing, what are the next steps for that, not only to get APA in there, but just, let these communities know that, we're here for the long run, but, we're willing to do these first steps after the immediate disaster recovery just to get the basic services up and running.
Okay. One last question. I know you've expressed some concern in other conversations about issues like loss of trees and
yes.
questions related to soft infrastructure, and that's always an interesting question in such a dense urban area as New York City. I mean, even in areas like the Rockaways, it's still fairly dense. What kinds of issues and concerns do you have with regard to the role of green infrastructure in the rebuilding in New York?
Well, I've heard two separate accounts of the impact of green infrastructure, and what it really boils down to is doing green infrastructure right. Mm-hmm. I was talking to Mike Levine, who's our intergovernmental VP here at the chapter, and he said some communities that had transformed their communities with their waterfront with green infrastructure didn't do very well compared to the very hard seawalls that other communities had. But meanwhile, when I was speaking with Chuck, he was just he was saying there's a differentiation between one community who just kind of did nice little garden landscape without much thought, and others who had seriously looked at ecological restoration, and those municipalities that put the extra time and effort into it, they fared comparatively well. And so it was just interesting hearing that comparison, because we do talk about green infrastructure, and we just it's become more mainstream, and we talk about it in a very just kind of like, hey, just implement green and it'll be great. And it's not always the case. If we're not doing it the right way, then it's just going to be as I said, a pretty garden along the waterfront that really does nothing to benefit the waterfront communities when a storm surge and flooding happens like this. So it's all about doing green infrastructure and soft infrastructure correctly, and sometimes it'll be blending of the hard infrastructure with the soft infrastructure. It's just a matter of looking at things regionally and then going into each municipality to see what works and how communities play off each other like that.
Right. So you essentially need some sort of comprehensive, thoughtful strategy rather than just dabbling in it in order to be effective.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And New York City, just in the last year released its amendments to the Waterfront Revitalization Plan, which was a great document. But even now they're reassessing it, because they said, maybe we can strengthen some areas that we hadn't before. But as I said, there's already been thinking about that. Stuff going on in Long Island and Jersey as well. So it's being thought about even pre Sandy, but thought about a lot more seriously, obviously now, because one issue with New York is that we have the benefit of many rivers, being one of the world's greatest ports, but we don't have a great relationship with the waterfront. We've been closed off for so long, and I know the mayor has been doing a lot in Manhattan and particularly Brooklyn, of developing the waterfront, rethinking, building parks, and slowly doing other areas like Hunters Point in Queens, the Bronx River up in the Bronx, and looking at fresh kills in Staten Island. But it's a slow but sure effort to re-engage the waterfront in one of the world's greatest ports.
Great. Well, thank you for participating in this interview for the Recovery News blog, and we appreciate your taking the time to do this.